The Lord of the Rings. There's a lot of analysis of it online, of its philosophy, history, lore, themes, and so on. But there is not so much about its politics. The main political writing one sees about Lord of the Rings is conservatives having conniption fits over leftists, criticizing it as racist, or supposedly putting woke politics into it. Stop putting politics into my video games. You're not my real dad. Shut up. On the merits, these defenses are ridiculous. Lord of the Rings was written by a British man in the 1930s and 40s. Of course, it's got some problematic aspects. It's undeniably white-centered, and the human allies of Sauron are clearly based on imperialist stereotypes. That said, Tolkien also has some interesting things to say about diversity. One of the best relationships in the story is between people from two different species getting over their prejudices and learning to trust one another. Even the Haradrim get a brief aside about how they were probably tricked by Sauron.
You wonder what his name is, where he came from, if he was really evil at heart. What lies or threats led him on this long march from home, if he'd not rather have stayed there.
But while the overheated conservative defenses are amusing, they also universally miss what is most notable about Lord of the Rings' politics for a conservative. Both the books and the movies have a perspective on conservatism that is so archaic and foreign to modern peoples, and especially Americans, that it seems incomprehensible. With the 20th anniversary of Peter Jackson's film trilogy coming up, I figure no better time than now to talk about it. So what is conservatism? Since the French Revolution and the rise of capitalism, we can characterize politics in wealthy countries as generally operating along an ideological spectrum from left to right. On the left side, we have egalitarianism, various brands of socialists, feminists, left liberals, and so on. These are the people who, broadly speaking, want to make society more equal. On the right side, we have hierarchy. Monarchists, right liberals, that sort of thing. These people want to roll back egalitarian advances, or preserve an unequal distribution of power and resources, or make it even more unequal. That is the essence, the beating heart of conservatism. Now, this spectrum leaves out a lot. Different political movements have filled up egalitarianism and hierarchy with very different contents, and there are always a lot of peculiar national characteristics in each left-right spectrum. And some ostensibly egalitarian projects, most notoriously the Soviet Union, have ended up just recreating another kind of hierarchy. However, that's not always the case. In the mid-20th century, left-wing parties in almost every rich country did indeed slash inequality with higher taxes and the welfare state, particularly the Swedish Social Democrats. So with that in mind, let's examine some political entities in Middle-earth. First, we have the Shire, an agricultural peasant community based on a somewhat romanticized image of medieval England. The chief political official is an elected mayor who appoints law enforcement in the form of the sheriffs. This is just about the only kind of democracy in Middle-earth, it seems. The Ents do have a sort of anarcho-syndicalist commune, but let's set them aside. Basically, everywhere else is some kind of kingdom. Gondor, Rohan, Rivendell, Lothlorien, Mordor, Numenor, Doriath, and so on. We've got dwarven monarchs like Balin, elven monarchs like Galadriel, and human monarchs like Elendil. Then we've got Sauron and Saruman, who are kings of a sort. Looking at this from a modern political perspective, it seems odd that any of these should be called free peoples.
The free peoples of Middle-earth.
Just about everyone is living in some kind of dictatorship.
You're fooling yourself. We're living in a dictatorship.
Of course, in the logic of a fantasy story, the answer is obvious. Sauron is an evil burning eyeball. He will turn everyone into exploited slaves. Saruman's lust for power drives him to send death squads out to defenseless villages, just like David Petraeus, and destroy the natural environment. Hey buddy, you ever heard of sustainable harvesting? But there is a deeper logic to this notion of free peoples. When King Theoden escapes from the domination of Saruman, Rohan is not freed in the sense that everyone gets to vote in a Bill of Rights. Rohan was a hierarchical kingdom when it was ruled by Saruman and Wormtongue, and it's still a kingdom when Theoden takes power again. It's freed in the sense that it now has a different kind of hierarchy, one characterized by duty and reciprocal obligation. Theoden rules his subjects, but he does not dominate them. He is in charge, but he genuinely tries to do what he thinks is best. When things go wrong, it is his fault, and he must sacrifice for his people.
What would you have me do? Look at my men. Their courage hangs by a thread.
Indeed, we see the weight of obligation is literally crushing. Lord of the Rings celebrates this kind of dutiful conservatism. Nearly every heroic character is some version of a morally grounded, humble leader who is concerned about wielding power wisely. Aragorn is a guy who is very worried that he will be corrupted by the One Ring through a lust for power, just like his ancestor Isildur.
The same blood flows in my veins, same weakness.
He has to be talked into assuming the Throne of Gondor, and when he does, one of his very first acts is to bow before some hobbits. In the book, there is repeated discussion about how a king should have the hands of a healer, and Aragorn indeed uses his knowledge of herbs to mend Éowyn, Merry, and Faramir. Galadriel is more comfortable with power, but she still resists the temptation of the ring, and is kindly enough to grant a personal request to a dwarf, one of the hereditary enemies of the elves. Oh, isn't that nice? Gandalf possesses supernatural abilities, but he uses them sparingly and only in defense of others. The only time he takes up political power is a brief episode when the steward Denethor gives up before the attack of Sauron, in a fit of despair and madness.
Prepare for battle!
Now, a kindly king is a familiar character in many stories, but Lord of the Rings takes the idea much more seriously and thoroughly than most fantasy works. The emotional core of the story, the bond between Sam and Frodo, is not about a friendship between equals. It is a relationship between master and servant. Frodo is Sam's superior, and both of them are clear about that fact.
Look after the others, especially Sam. He will not understand.
Still, Frodo loves Sam, and Sam is utterly devoted to Frodo to the point of carrying him up the side of a volcano. Tolkien's suspicion of power is part of what makes Frodo such an unusual protagonist. He must carry the ring precisely because he is weak. Gandalf cannot even touch it because he is too powerful. He'd act like a sort of conduit to Sauron's evil.
You must take it!
You cannot offer me this ring.
I'm giving it to you!
Don't tempt me, Frodo.
Now let me return to real life. Today, dutiful conservatism is utterly absent from the Conservative Party in the United States. During the pandemic, we have seen conservatives not just disagreeing with measures to save American lives, including their own, but violently threatening people who try to do it. People are dead, or crapping out chunks of their intestines, because they listen to deranged conservative propagandists. Even some of the propagandists themselves are dead. It's grotesque. Moreover, dutifulness of any sort is also fairly alien to the broader American culture, especially in post-9/11 works. In popular books, movies, TV shows, video games, and so on, heroic characters generally seek power and use it without question. Consider torture. It has become a pop culture cliche for heroic protagonists to use torture to extract information from recalcitrant enemies. In shows like 24, using power over another human being in the most horrible and ruthless fashion imaginable is shown to be a simple and effective method of gathering intelligence, and a way for tough characters to demonstrate their willingness to do what has to be done in contrast to weak-minded liberal cowards. These cliches influenced real life, as we saw in Abu Ghraib and Afghanistan and some legal decisions. There's just one problem. As Reed College professor Darius Rajali shows in excruciating detail in his book Torture and Democracy, the whole idea is an appalling falsehood. He writes, "For harvesting information, torture is the clumsiest method available to organizations, even clumsier in some cases than flipping coins or shooting randomly into crowds. The sources of error are systematic and ineradicable. American conservatives naturally deny all evidence of the utter failure of the CIA torture program and continue to insist that torture works great. Anyway, I think it's open to question whether this type of dutiful conservatism can ever really exist. In my view, any honest and healthy affection must be between equals. And if we look at the history of monarchs and conservative parties, insane lust for power is a lot more common than being like Aragorn or Theoden. Tolkien was a romantic, not a realist. But then again, I am a socialist, so I would say that. However, dutiful conservative behavior is not wholly absent from history either, especially if we look outside the U.S. We see it in conservative German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck's decision to set up a universal health insurance system in 1883, in part to buy off the working class away from socialist parties, but also because Germans needed healthcare like anyone. We see it in Benjamin Disraeli's argument in the mid-19th century that the British Conservative Party should try to get the poor to ally with landowners by protecting them from exploitation by ruthless businessmen. And we see it in Tsar Alexander II's decision to abolish serfdom in the Russian Empire in 1861. These arguments and actions were self-serving, but they still had real effects in the world. The U.S. doesn't really have a tradition of this kind of conservatism. You could argue for Dwight Eisenhower, but given his record of expanding welfare benefits and massive state infrastructure spending, and the fact that modern conservatives have either forgotten or hate him, and they called him a communist at the time, I don't think he counts. To understand why, we need to talk about feudalism and capitalism. Bracketing a ton of complexity, feudal societies typically had systems of obligations extending between kings, lords, vassals, and peasants, the poor farmers who were the great majority of the population. In feudal times, you could not own land in the sense we mean today, where an owner can do just about whatever he or she wants with it. If you were a mid-level noble, for instance, you were granted land by the local lord or king, and you had corresponding duties going both up and down the social ladder. You lived on the land and could extract rent from the peasants, but you had a duty to protect them from foreign armies or bandits. Meanwhile, while peasants paid rent or had to work for the lord for free, they typically had rights to farm crops for themselves after having performed their required labor, or to cut wood in the lord's forest, or got other benefits. Now, I don't want to idealize feudalism as Tolkien arguably does. Feudal lords were often brutally abusive or worse. The point is that nobles and kings did not delude themselves that they had somehow earned their position through hard work and determination, and they took for granted the fact that the peasants they ruled needed at least enough resources to live off, if for no other reason than otherwise they could not produce the surplus that supported the noble class. Capitalism evolved out of feudalism, but its structure was very different in two important ways. On the one hand, peasant agriculture was an obstacle to its development. It needed those people off the land and into coal mines, steel mills, textile factories, and so on. This was accomplished in many ways, but principally innovations in agriculture to increase the efficiency of farming, enclosure laws to remove peasant access to the land, and poor laws, brutally punishing vagrants or the unemployed. As capitalism took hold, the working class was forced to go work for business owners just to survive, even though there were frequently not enough jobs to go around. On the other hand, the capitalist did not get his position through some kind of purportedly divinely sanctioned inheritance. He started a business on his own, or if he did inherit one, it was from someone who had done the same thing in the past. It conveniently seemed to him that he had earned his place, and that if the working class had not become rich like him, then it was because they were lazy, thus reinforcing the view that they needed the constant threat of starvation to discipline them and force them into his factories. There's just one problem. Huge chunks of society cannot or should not work. It's immoral to force children, disabled people, or the elderly to work, for instance, and many of them will not be able to do it even if you tried. Half the point of being a student is to learn some skills that might be useful in work later on. And then, even when the economy is doing well, people are constantly losing their jobs or quitting and transferring to new ones. When times are bad, there are not nearly enough jobs to go around. If we look at American statistics, about half the population does not work because about half the population is made up of those categories. So if we have purely capitalist institutions where the only way to earn money is by working or owning property, that means half the population will receive no income and millions will be left destitute. Sure enough, if you look at who is poor in the United States, the overwhelming majority of them are either children, seniors, disabled folks, carers, students, or the unemployed. And at least one of those categories will apply to all of us at one point or another. The typical person starts as a child, progresses through school, has many jobs, and eventually becomes old and dies. Disability can strike a healthy person at any time. In his book, The Age of Revolution, the historian Eric Hobsbawm describes how this system and ideology made industrializing countries in the 19th century some of the most wretched places to be poor in all of human history. The middle-class world was freely open to all. Those who failed to enter its gates therefore demonstrated a lack of personal intelligence, moral force, or energy which automatically condemned them, or at best a historic or racial heritage which must permanently cripple them, or else they would already have made use of their opportunities. The period which culminated about the middle of the 19th century was therefore one of unexampled callousness, not merely because the poverty which surrounded middle-class respectability was so shocking that the native rich learned not to see it, leaving its horrors to make their full impact only on visiting foreigners, but because the poor, like the outer barbarians, were talked of as though they were not properly human at all. If their fate was to become industrial laborers, they were merely a mass to be forced into the proper disciplinary mold by sheer coercion, the draconic factory discipline being supplemented by the aid of the state. They ought to be constantly on the verge of starvation, because otherwise they would not work, being inaccessible to human motives. It is to the interest of the worker himself, French economist Villarmé was told in the late 1830s by employers, that he should be constantly harassed by need, for then he will not set his children a bad example, and his poverty will be a guarantee of good behavior. It was but a small step from such an attitude to the formal recognition of inequality, which, as Henri Baudrillard argued in his inaugural lecture at the Collège de France in 1853, was one of the three pillars of human society, the other two being property and inheritance. The hierarchical society was thus reconstructed on the foundations of formal equality. It had merely lost what made it tolerable in the old days, the general social conviction that men had duties and rights, that virtue was not simply the equivalent of money, and that the lower order, though low, had a right to their modest lives and the station to which God had called them. This is capitalist conservatism, a version of hierarchy emerging from a brutal, chaotic, and unstable economic system that creates mass destitution as an inescapable consequence of its internal functioning. This is the type of conservatism that has dominated the United States since the 1890s at least. There are more reasons why American conservatives have no sense of duty, and I may get into them in future videos. But a big one is that the Republican Party is welded to orthodox capitalism. Now, it isn't just Republicans who adhere to the moral value of working for capitalists, the inherent laziness of the working class, and the need to discipline them through the threat of starvation. For instance, on the Democratic side, in 1996, Bill Clinton signed a welfare reform bill that abolished a benefit for poor mothers for this reason.
Welfare, a chance to draw a paycheck, not a welfare check.
But capitalist morality has sunk much deeper roots in the Republican Party. In April 2020, near the very beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, Lindsey Graham and other Republican senators insisted that the boost to unemployment benefits passed the previous month would be expanded over our dead bodies. On Fox News, Laura Ingraham recently spoke with a host of the show Bar Rescue about the need to keep the working class desperate and hungry.
What if we gave that additional unemployment benefits to employers to incentivize people to go to work?
Well, what if we just cut off the unemployment? I mean, hunger is a pretty powerful thing.
You know, I think that's right.
Old
I have
school.
a friend in the military who trains military dogs, Laura, and they only feed a military dog at night because a hungry dog is an obedient dog.
All this makes a mockery of American conservatives' pretense that they are defending tradition and slowing change, standing athwart history yelling stop, in the words of National Review's William F. Buckley. Capitalism is a social solvent that dissolves tradition and accelerates change, yet American conservatives defend it at every turn because that is what their version of hierarchy demands. As the critic George Shalaba wrote in a review of a Buckley biography, that capitalism is subversive of prejudice, tradition, customary morality is something thoughtful conservatives have generally understood and honest conservatives generally admitted. William F. Buckley has done neither, a failure that is at the center of gravity of his career. Now we see finally how this has made American conservatives so insane. Like all conservative factions under capitalism, they face a choice between catering to the material needs of their voting base or sticking with worker-starving capitalist orthodoxy. For well over a century, they have chosen the second option. In the 1930s, they stuck to capitalist dogma even while unemployment soared to 25% and the country neared total collapse. Even when that awesome failure put them out of power for 30 years, movement conservatives kept the old faith. By the 1980s, they were back to deregulating business, slashing welfare, and cutting taxes on the rich. Then they kept the loyalty of their base by whipping them into a frenzy with culture war, insanity, and bigotry. And one big reason that the option was so easy for them is because there is no tradition of non-capitalist conservatism in this country. No monarchy or aristocracy. Now, Donald Trump did run a campaign promising he would defend welfare benefits and attack corporate oligarchs, but he governed as an orthodox tax-cutting capitalist. Since the 1980s at least, Republicans have chosen the low road at every single occasion, behaving with gleefully immoral irresponsibility to whip up hatred against liberals, while their own voters are looted by oligarchs or die of preventable disease. It hasn't failed them yet. Today they are pushing it to a low point even I thought they weren't capable of, convincing their own loyal party members to poison themselves with quack, nonsense, snake oil remedies instead of taking a highly effective free vaccine that was developed with their own tax dollars. Lord of the Rings has characters whose compulsive lust for power drives them to behave with sociopathic immorality or sacrifice their own followers by the tens of thousands. They are Sauron, Saruman, and Morgoth. That is modern American conservatism for you.
His cruelty, his malice, and his will to dominate all life.
Anyway, Lord of the Rings is a great work of literature in many ways. But I think one reason it appeals to modern peoples today, particularly Americans, is this vision of dutiful conservatism. One reason is the example it sets. Conservative parties are universal in every democratic country. Even the greatest left-wing electoral record in history, that of the Swedish Social Democrats after 1932, was eventually broken in 1976. It is comforting to think that even if a conservative party wins, they will at least not tear the country to ribbons in a deranged quest for personal enrichment or power at any cost. I think most liberals and leftists can agree that Norway's former conservative Prime Minister Emma Solberg was categorically better than Donald Trump. Hell, she's better than the vast majority of U.S. presidents, period, though that isn't saying much. But perhaps more deeply, we can't avoid the fact that leadership is inherent in any kind of collective activity, whether it's work, politics, activism, or even hobbies. No matter how distributed and egalitarian a decision-making process, there are always going to be some people who are more interested and influential in the process. At least a little hierarchy is inescapable. There can be no politics without power. I think it is not entirely a coincidence that the best and most left-wing president in American history, Franklin D. Roosevelt, was a scion of a family that had been wealthy for generations. He was essentially an aristocrat. But for that very reason, he was not hypnotized by notions that he had somehow earned his power, and hence had no trouble betraying his own class if he thought that that was necessary to lead well and win political battles.
They had begun to consider the government of the United States as a mere appendage to their own affairs, And we know now that government by organized money is just as dangerous as government by organized mob. Never before in all our history have these forces been so united against one candidate as they stand today. They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
Now, that is not to say that only aristocrats can be good leaders. The best union organizer in American history, Walter Reuther, came from a working class background. Good leaders can come from anywhere. But to be good, they must take their duty, their power, and the potential for corruption seriously. Stories abound of left-wing organizations where someone got some power, it instantly went to their head, and the organization's purpose became corrupted. And I suspect that is another reason why so many Americans are attracted to figures like Gandalf, Theoden, Galadriel, and Aragorn. That's the beauty of Middle-earth. Aside from the magic and the romance of fantasy, almost all the leadership class are people worth following, even setting aside the completely deranged maniacs who are doing their level best to spread a deadly pandemic disease today. When is the last time you voted for someone enthusiastically who actually did win and didn't later disappoint you? I'm 35 years old and I've done that just twice, both for minor local positions. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to trust the person in charge? Thanks for watching, folks. I'd appreciate it if you could like, subscribe, and all that crap. This video is just a little experiment I felt like trying after 8 years. Jesus Lord. So if you want to see some more like this, pass it around to a friend. If it does reasonably well, I'll brush some more rust off and do another. And by the way, my main job is as a writer and journalist, not a video guy. If you want to check that out, you can subscribe to my newsletter. The link is in the description. Take care.